Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. This week, I'm going to talk to you about an issue that I know I've talked about before, but it bears revisiting and reemphasizing from time to time, and that, of course, is the deadly and destructive war on drugs. And what motivates me to talk about this issue today is that I participated in a really interesting drug war panel yesterday at the Cato Institute. The panel was about a paper that Ted Galen Carpenter, who's been with Cato for many, many years and who's really one of my real-life libertarian heroes, has written on the phenomenon of synthetic drugs or designer drugs and how black market entrepreneurs are responding to the drug war by coming up with these synthetic drugs. And of course, a central element in the panel discussion was just the utter futility of the war on drugs, is reflected by the rise of these designer and synthetic drugs. So it was a real stimulating panel. I won't go into all the arguments and so forth because you can see it online. You can Google C-SPAN 3. It was covered by C-SPAN 3 and check it out there. Or we're going to be posting it in our FFF Daily this week. And I think it's worth looking at, especially not only just the comments that all the speakers made. There was three of us plus the moderator, Chris Preble from Cato. But there was also a very, very interesting Q&A session. Very thoughtful and thought-provoking questions that were coming out of the audience. And one of which was the very first questioner. And she was a self-described prohibitionist. She favors the drug war. So here she was in a libertarian organization covering a panel that calls for drug legalization, and she was there. And so she was talking about the dangers of illicit drugs and the damage they do to people and how we need to keep waging this war on drugs. Well, I was kind of curious about this. So after the session, I went up to her and started talking to her a little bit about her views and asked her to explain these views because I find the mindset of a statist really fascinating. I mean, it seems like life creates statists and libertarians, and sometimes I wonder whether libertarians are just born, or whether they can be made, but I'm always fascinated by what kind of mindset a statist has. And so I drew her out, and she was more than willing to talk. And she told me about how horrible drugs are and how dangerous they are and what damage they do, especially to young people. And I told her, I said, I have the utmost respect for what you do. That certainly there are many people who would agree with her that drugs are damaging. And they're very destructive and very harmful, at least some of them, and under certain circumstances. And that drug addiction is something that we can all sympathize with. But what I was curious about is, and I told her, I said, why do you want to turn to the government, though, to punish a person who's like an addict or something, to put him in jail? And she says, oh, because that's the only way that you can deal with this problem, that sometimes education or persuasion is not sufficient. And so I find that a fascinating mindset. I said, so you would put someone in jail who rejects your views? And she says, absolutely, for their own good. that was sort of the argument, And so I said to her, I said, well, you're not a libertarian, are you? And she said, oh, of course not. I'm not a libertarian. And I said, well, if I come over to you and start, imposing my views on you and telling you how you need to be a libertarian because, the opposite is so damaging and destructive, I mean, won't you find that kind of offensive after a certain point? And she said, absolutely. And I said, well, and if I got the state to put you into jail or sent you into libertarian rehab or re-education camp, I think that you'd find that pretty offensive too, wouldn't you? And of course, she knew where that was going. And I said, well, if I want to ingest substances that you don't approve of, okay, you can come and tell me that it's damaging to me, but at some point I'm going to say, butt out of my life. And yet you don't want to butt out of my life. You want to put me in jail. And then she brings up the idea of decriminalization. And she says, I don't want to put people in jail. I'm not one of those. I believe in decriminalization. Okay, so that raises the fascinating issue that I thought I would discuss today. and in a larger context, the concept of decriminalization versus legalization. And so I asked her, what do you mean exactly by decriminalization? And she says, well, drug users that are caught, violating the drug laws, would be given like a fine, a monetary fine. And if they wanted to avoid the fine, they could go into rehab. And so she says, this is a way we encourage people to go into rehab, by giving them the choice between the fine or the rehabilitation. Well, there's a lot of libertarians that favor this. And so I thought, well, I'm going to address this in the libertarian angle today. Now, those of you who subscribe to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, know that I've begun a series called Why We Don't Compromise here at FFF. I mean, from the very beginning, at our inception 25 years ago, we have taken the position that we would never compromise any libertarian principles. My feeling was that if you compromise a principle, you're really abandoning it. And that's what a compromise is when it comes to principles. You're rejecting the principle, and you're endorsing a compromise, an abandonment of the principle. Well, this concept arises within the context of the drug war, because there's all kinds of libertarian reforms that come into the drug war. I mean, let's face it, we all agree as libertarians that this thing is a horrific government program. It is not only futile, as I pointed out in my presentation yesterday at the Cato Institute, that it's deadly, it's destructive, it has all these adverse consequences to it. Mandatory minimum sentences, overcrowded penitentiaries, ruination of lives, asset forfeiture laws where the cops are stealing from people on the highways, like real highway robbery. And then you got corruption in the judiciary, bribes in federal prosecutors and DEA agents and deputy sheriffs. And it's destroying the fabric of society, infringements on liberty and privacy and financial reporting and bank reporting requirements. There's the tentacles of the drug war just go really far. They stretch out everywhere. Look what they've done to Mexico. They've destroyed the entire country there through the militarization of the police. Okay, so in the context of the drug war, you see people in the libertarian movement calling for reforms. For example, let's say there's an organization that calls for the abolition of asset forfeiture laws, or let's say a reduction in asset forfeiture seizures, so that, let's say, a reform called for that a cop could only, the police department could only confiscate $10,000 a month in asset forfeiture, or eliminating mandatory minimum sentences and giving judges discretion on how much of a sentence to give a person depending on what they felt was proper in the context of his criminal record and the particular offense. All of us as libertarians would say these are valuable reforms. That they improve life for the people that are suffering under a regime of drug controls. But there's just one important thing that we've got to keep in mind, and that's the import, one of the imports of my series, Why We Don't Compromise here at FFF. And that thing that we have to constantly keep in mind is that none of these reforms are freedom. In other words, they improve life for people suffering under a horrible statist regime, but it's not freedom. Now, let me give you an example. And it's an example I talk about in my series in Future of Freedom, our monthly journal. Slavery. Okay, there's people today that are they're ardent opponents of slavery. They make a passionate case against slavery. And they explain why slavery was horrendous, and they make a very principled and eloquent case against slavery. But there's just one problem with that, though, is that slavery is not really a burning issue of our time. It was a burning issue back in the 1800s. And I recently read an article that said that the number of abolitionists, or dismantlers, as I also call abolitionists, was very, very small in, like, say, 1850 America. and especially in the South. I mean, to be a dismantler of slavery, an advocate of dismantling the slavery system in Georgia or South Carolina and in Texas and in the 1850s, that would not have been an easy thing to do. It would have been taken great courage to stand up there and say, we need to dismantle this system. Now, I assume that there were people that were trying to improve the lives of the slaves. Let's say we call them slavery reformers. And let's just hypothetically say that an organization came up with a plan to make life better on the plantation. And so you've got a reform consisting of adopted by the state, enacted through the legislature and so forth, or let's say even imposed by the federal government, that says a mandatory 8-hour workday for the slaves, no lashing. They get a voucher, similar to school vouchers that a lot of libertarians favor, where the slave would be able to be free to choose any other plantation once in his lifetime. He gets to switch anytime he wants. So he has choice, okay? He's choice. And then you've got, let's say, free housing, free health care, free food, and you've got, let's say, a stipend of $25 a month. Well, all of us would say, my gosh, that's a significantly better system than existed without the reforms. Even some of the slaves would say, hey, yeah, bring it on. I mean, this is much better than what we're living under. And so, the reform package would improve the lives of the slaves. But there's just one big problem with it. And it's a no-brainer. I know you're sitting there saying, Jacob, there's a big problem there. The problem is it's not freedom. Okay? It's a better way of life on the plantation, no doubt about that. But it's not freedom. Now, the same argument applies to the serfdom society in which we live. And every libertarian would I think, agree that we live under a very highly controlled, very socialistic type of system here. It's what really is a serfdom system. We're in a sense plantations we're serfs on the serfdom plantation here in the United States. And a good example of this is the drug war, where the government wants to take care of us, like that lady that I was talking to, that the governments and the drug war advocates want to take care of us. They want to prevent us from doing harmful things to ourselves. They want to watch over us. And if we don't follow their advice, they put us into jail. And so, all these kind of reforms come up among libertarians saying, well, let's reform the drug war. Let's get rid of mandatory minimum sentences. Let's reform asset forfeiture laws. Let's give pardons to people that are in the penitentiary. All of this is great stuff, but there's just one problem with it. It's not freedom. Freedom entails the right to ingest whatever you want to ingest, no matter how dangerous it is, no matter how destructive. I mean, it's not, as I said in the panel yesterday, it's not a coincidence that they have drug laws in Cuba and North Korea and China and Vietnam, and as Ted Carpenter pointed out, in Russia and Iran. Authoritarian, totalitarian societies, both from the left and the right, have drug laws, because this is one of the best ways of controlling people in tyrannical regimes. A drug war and drug laws have no place in a free society. So while reforms will improve the lives of the serfs on the serfdom plantation, it's not freedom. Freedom necessarily entails a dismantling of the infringement on freedom. In other words, if there is an infringement on freedom, that's obviously not freedom. In order to get freedom, you have to remove the infringement so that you're just left with freedom. Therefore, freedom equals dismantling of infringements on freedom, which means dismantling the entire war on drugs. From marijuana, from booze, cigarettes, caffeine, to marijuana, all the way up to these synthetic drugs. No matter how dangerous, no matter how self-destructive, freedom necessarily entails living your life the way you want, so long as your conduct is peaceful, as long as you're not going out murdering and raping and stealing and burglarizing, even under the influence of drugs. That's no excuse. That you're free to live your life any way you choose. And so notice something important here, that when we're making the case for freedom, the case for dismantling is significantly different from the case for reform, because reform necessarily entails convincing people, or letting people remain convinced, that the state plays a legitimate role in this area of drug use or drug possession or distribution. And so, I mean, when you're saying, well, let's reform this and let's reform this aspect of the law and then reform this aspect of the law, you're conveying a message that, okay, yes, the state has a legitimate role here, but we can make it better. We can make it less oppressive. That's totally different from the argument for dismantling, because as soon as you start calling for dismantling, the arguments are entirely different. Now you're saying the state has no legitimate role here. It is the right of the individual to engage in any kind of peaceful behavior, including drug usage, without state involvement. So, okay, how do we achieve this then? Well, that's one of the things I address in my series in Future of Freedom. That you have to reach a critical mass of dismantlers. That, you know, just because you have a bunch of reformers, that's not going to bring the dismantling, because it's not causing people to question the role of government in that particular area. Now, obviously, it's possible to be a reformer and a dismantler at the same time. But ordinarily what happens is that people become so consumed with the reform that they don't want to alienate people by saying, well, you know, we really need to dismantle this whole thing. So in order to dismantle it, you need to reach a critical mass of people who favor dismantling, who are calling for dismantling, and then all of a sudden society shifts. And that's how the great movements of liberty have been achieved, by reaching this critical mass, which can be significantly less than the majority in society. That you see this in companies all the time, where they reach a critical mass that maybe is like 10% of the company, and then it just shifts. Now, this applies across the board. Is not just on drug legalization, although this is a good example. In fact, if we go back to our example of decriminalization versus legalization, legalization is like a total dismantling of the whole drug war structure, where people are free to ingest anything, they can sell anything. I mean, it would put the drug lords and the drug cartels out of business, as we were talking about in the panel yesterday. And you have reputable pharmacies and pharmaceutical companies that are now, and reputable dealers that are worried about getting sued. So the quality of the product it goes up. The addict can be assured that he's getting a good product instead of polluted, corrupted product that in the black market that kills many of these people. But notice that if there's decriminalization, that's clearly a much better situation than we have today. I mean, nobody going to jail anymore for drug possession or drug usage, and I think they still want to put people in jail for distributing, which is ridiculous. If you're not going to be punishing people for possessing, why punish people for that are given the drugs? But notice it's a significantly better situation, much like that reform of slavery would have been better for the slaves. But it's not freedom. Freedom entails a dismantling of the system. And so this applies across the board, as I'm talking about in my series. For example, freedom necessarily entails the right to keep everything you earn and decide for yourself what to do with it. I mean, that's just, to me, it's a no-brainer. And you know, some people say, oh, well, that's pie in the sky, Jacob. That's not achievable. That's not practical. We've got an Internal Revenue Service. You couldn't ever accomplish that. That's just, you know, pie in the sky. It can't be done. Well, except for the fact that it was done. It was done by the American people for more than 100 years. There was no income tax. There was no IRS. People kept everything they earned for more than a century. So, I mean, don't tell me that it can't be done, because it was done. Now, is it difficult to re-achieve that? Of course it's difficult, but it's not impossible, because that was one of the things that our ancestors proved, that it is possible to have a society without income taxation and an IRS, where people are free to keep everything they earn. And now, so that is another necessary prerequisite of freedom, the right to keep everything you earn and to decide for yourself what to do with it. Now, obviously, if you have a gigantic welfare state, including the drug war, and I put the drug war under the welfare state because it's guided by this, it's driven by this paternalistic mindset that the state needs to take care of people, and a warfare state, which of course also encompasses the drug war because you've got the increasing militarization of the cops, the bashing down of the doors, the SWAT teams, the military garments, the tanks, and of course the militarization of Latin America over the drug war. Well, when you've chosen to have a big welfare state and a warfare state apparatus attached to your original governmental system, you're going to need a lot of money. You're going to need an income tax and a Federal Reserve and printed money and out of control spending and debt and so forth to finance this thing, especially with all the overseas operations that come with imperial escapades, invasions, occupations, and so forth. But our ancestors, they wouldn't have anything to do with either one of those things. They didn't have a welfare state. They didn't have a warfare state. They just had this original governmental system with very limited powers. So they didn't need an income tax and an IRS and a Federal Reserve. They used gold and silver coins, and they kept everything they earned. Okay, so the welfare state comes along with Franklin Roosevelt in the 30s, and Roosevelt says, okay, we're going to change it. Now, he wasn't this direct, but this is what he was doing with his New Deal. He was adopting a combination of socialism and what we would call economic fascism. Now, economic fascism is an economic system where the government leaves property in private control, private hands, private ownership, but then tells people what to do with it, as compared to the socialist system where the government just takes people's property and then does what the government wants to do with it. For example, Social Security is what we would call a socialistic system. It originated among socialists in Germany, who then, it was then adopted by Otto von Bismarck, the so-called Iron Chancellor of Germany, and then Roosevelt gets it from Bismarck, and that's why on the website of the Social Security Administration here in the United States is a bust for Otto von Bismarck, because that's where this socialist idea came in. And now, with the socialist idea, the government says we're going to confiscate people's money who are working, and we're going to give it to the seniors who are not working. So it's not a retirement plan. You don't take. We often hear the phrase. Even libertarians fall for this sometimes. They say, "Oh, I put my money in. I've been putting it in for decades. I've been putting my money in." No, that's not the way the socialist system works. It's just a straight welfare plan, and it was always built that way. The Supreme Court upheld it many, many years ago. It's just a straight welfare plan. Now, it happens to be financed by a payroll tax. They call it a Social Security tax or whatever, but it doesn't matter how it's financed because they didn't even need a Social Security tax or a FICA tax. Could have been just funded out of general tax revenues taken by the IRS, income tax, where they just take money from people who are working and they transfer it to seniors. Okay, that's the old Marxian idea, from each according to ability to each according to need. So Roosevelt had that. It was an entirely different way of life for the United States. He used what was really the temporary emergency of the New Deal, of the Great Depression, to adopt his New Deal. And adopt a permanent welfare state socialistic program for America. Now, he also had elements of economic fascism. That was what the National Industrial Recovery Act was all about. He left industry. He didn't nationalize industries. He nationalized gold. Of course, everybody had to turn their gold into the government, but he didn't nationalize industries like the socialists were doing in socialist countries. He left it in private hands, but then through a series of cartels, the government would direct how these businesses were going to be managed, what their labor contracts were going to say and what the prices they were going to charge for and what they were going to pay in terms of wages. And so this is the old Mussolini idea that we leave, private property in private hands, but then the government directs it. In fact, there's a great book on this, on Roosevelt's New Deal called Three New Deals. By a guy named Shivelbush. You can get it on Amazon. And it's great. It compares Roosevelt's socialist fascist program with those of Hitler, that was doing much the same thing, leaving businesses in private hands, but directing what they should do. And of course, Mussolini's system that involved the same sort of thing. So what happens with in the area of reform, with libertarian reform, a lot of times people don't want to, libertarians are reluctant to call for dismantling the serfdom system. I mean, they'll be very, very fervent about, opposing slavery and how slavery should have been dismantled and not reformed. And they'll say, no, reform of slavery would not have been good. It should have been dismantled. But when it comes over here to serfdom, they say, oh, well, let's just reform the serfdom. Let's not dismantle it. Let's reform it. And one of the reforms is, hey, let's leave people free to keep their own money, but then order them, have the government order what they should do with that money. Let give you a hypothetical example. Let's say you abolish the IRS, you abolish the income tax, but then you tell people 10% of your money will go into a mandatory retirement account. 10% will go to mandatory charity. You can pick your charity of choice, and so you can pick whatever charity you want, but 10% has got to go to charity. 10% has got to go to, say, saving for a new car, because, your car's depreciating over time. You're going to need the money to do that, and if you don't save it, you're going to find yourself going into deep in debt. So we're going to mandate 10% that goes into a car fund. 10% for education for your children, because they're going to have college expenses, so you're going to mandate 10% for educational expenses, and all this is going to be required by law. Now, would that be a better system than the government just seizing people's money to pay for children's education and Social Security and health care, Medicare and so forth? It might be. I don't know. I know that there's been this ongoing debate between the fascists and the socialists for maybe a century, where which system is better. In fact, there's this ongoing debate in Chile over this precise issue, that when General Pinochet, who was about the epitome of a fascist dictator, I mean, this guy idolized Franco of Spain. He was the only ruler to go to Franco's funeral, and of course Franco himself idolized Hitler. Pinochet, he was opposed to the socialist social security system that his predecessor, that he had ousted in a violent U.S.-supported coup, Salvador Allende, had adopted, which was modeled on the U.S. system, the FDR system, where the government takes money from the productive and gives it to the seniors. Well, so Pinochet adopts the fascist plan. He says, look, we're going to leave people free to keep their money, but we're going to mandate that they put them into retirement accounts. So there's this ongoing debate right now. There's people in Chile that want to restore the old system, the socialist system. Their argument is, hey, if the stock market crashes, everybody loses their retirement. They lose their savings. And so here a socialist system is better, because there's always going to be people working, and so the seniors can always be assured of a sufficient supply of money coming in their senior years. Okay, so which side is right? I don't know. They can debate that all along. As a libertarian, I don't really care, because you see, neither system is freedom. And that's what we libertarians are all about. We're about freedom. We want to achieve the free society. And so we shouldn't be interested in reforming the system or making it better any more than we should have been interested in reforming the slavery system in the 1850s. We should be about dismantling. And this is the point of my series of articles. This is why we don't compromise, is that we are dismantlers. We want to focus on the infringements on freedom, and we want to remove them. We want to dismantle them, because that's what freedom equals. Freedom equals dismantling infringements on freedom. And so we don't want to mandate that people do this with their money or do that with their money. We want people to be free to keep everything they earn, and they decide for themselves what to do with it. If somebody says, I don't want to save for my retirement, I want to go travel around the world. I got $50,000 in savings, and I'm going to blow it in an around the world trip, and I'm going to for 2 years, and I'm having a great time. Fine. That's their right. That's their business. That's what freedom is all about. And so, yeah, we're looking for dismantlers. When we're doing our articles here at FFF, we're doing that for a reason. we're looking for dismantlers because we figure that, okay, the reformers are making life better. No question about it. Well, there is some question. Sometimes the reforms make life even worse. I mean, a good example of that is school vouchers. I mean, vouchers have made an entire segment of society dependent on the largesse of the state. The private schools that are now dependent on vouchers, I mean, they're going to be the last ones that are going to say, let's end the voucher program. And so you've got an entire segment of society now that are not thinking about dismantling state involvement in education, which is really what freedom is all about, educational liberty. So the voucher proponents, including those in the libertarian movement, have made our lives, as those of us that are fighting for the free society, much more difficult by putting so many more people on the dole, in this case the voucher dole. So it's not necessarily true that all libertarian reforms end up with a better situation in terms of a free society. But let's assume that basically libertarian reforms make life better for the serfs. Great, but it's not freedom. And can we achieve the free society? Well, yeah, of course we can. And so to recapitulate, why do we not compromise here at FFF? Okay, number one, because we want to be free. Okay, I mean that's our goal here. We want the free society. We're not interested in a reformed serfdom. We're not interested in a reformed slavery. We're interested in freedom. We want to be free. And second, freedom equals removing the infringements on freedom. So in an educational sense, it means getting the state out of the education business. In a charity sense, getting the state out of the charity business. In the retirement field, getting the state out of the retirement field, whether it's seizing people's income to finance all these things, education, healthcare, retirement, or ordering them to do what they want with their money, that's not freedom. Now, you can come up with all kinds of reforms again that might make life better for the serfs on the plantation. But we here at FFF, we want to be free, and we understand that freedom necessarily entails not reforming infringements on freedom, not making them more efficient. Freedom necessarily entails removing them. And the third thing is, we believe it's achievable. Some people talk in terms of, oh, we can achieve freedom 40 years from now, investing in the young and so forth so they can achieve freedom. Well, I can tell you, when I was in my 20s, older people said the same thing to me. I discovered libertarianism when I was in my late 20s, and older people were saying, Jacob, we're investing in you because you're the young person and you're among the young libertarians and you can bring us freedom, 40 years from now or so forth. And now, we who were the young people are now saying, oh, well, the young people can bring freedom for 40 years from now. Well, I'm not interested in freedom 40 years from now. I'm interested in freedom now in the near term. And so I'm always looking for dismantlers, including among the young. I mean, that's why we should be investing in the young and investing in the middle-aged and investing in the old seniors and investing in everybody who's interested in dismantling the infringements on freedom, because dismantling, again, equals freedom. So the more young people that are involved in this, more energy, more dynamism, that are interested in dismantling as compared to freedom, the closer we get to that free society, the closer we get to that critical mass that brings the shift to the free society that really we libertarians are really all about. That's the show for this week. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week.